The arrival of war. The sky was glowing red like blood as the first alien warships came down from the clouds, shaking the earth with a roar so loud it made windows explode and birds vanish into silence. The colony had been quiet just hours ago, with people working on their farms, fixing machines, and laughing in the fields. Now all that peace was torn apart by the arrival of the Zarn, a brutal species of war-loving creatures with metal skin, glowing eyes, and weapons that could turn stone into dust in seconds. The human colony on Tau Delta 9 was small but strong, mostly made of engineers, miners, farmers, and a few old soldiers like Commander Rigg, who had seen enough war in his younger years to know this was not just an invasion. This was extermination. Rigg stood in the middle of the colony square, gripping his belt not with a gun, but with a hammer used to fix solar panels. He looked around at the frightened faces of people, clutching whatever they could find: a broom, a crowbar, a pipe wrench, even a kitchen knife. His voice was rough like gravel, but calm and solid like steel. When he said, "They want us to run, they expect fear, but they forgot one thing: humans do not break. We bend, we bleed, we burn, but we do not break you. Use what you got, because right now anything can be a weapon." His words sparked something deep inside them, a fire that fear could not drown. People began pulling apart their workshops, grabbing sharp tools, tying blades to sticks, welding scrap metal into shields. One woman who baked bread every morning poured hot oil into jars and set them near the windows, ready to throw them on any alien that stepped inside. The schoolteacher turned desks into barricades while the mechanic fitted chainsaws onto wheelbarrows. It was chaos, but it was organized chaos, and in the middle of it all, Rigg walked with steady steps, guiding his people like a general leading warriors, not civilians. First attack hit at dusk when the red light of the dying sun reflected off the alien armor, making them look like walking flames. The Zarn soldiers, tall and cruel, burst through the outer fence, expecting an easy slaughter. Instead, they were met with boiling oil, flying hammers, and sharpened steel pipes flying like spears. One Zarn tried to aim his plasma rifle, but slipped on spilled motor oil and was knocked down by an old man with a wooden ladder to the head. Another alien was blinded by a blast of flour thrown by a baker, who then swung a shovel at its legs, knocking it flat. The aliens howled in confusion. They had come for war, but found insanity. Commander Rigg ducked behind a broken transport shuttle. Using its engine as cover, he held a welding torch in one hand and a crowbar in the other. Beside him, a teenager named Joe had strapped nails to a baseball bat and was panting hard, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and rage. She said, "I thought we would be dead by now." Rigg looked at her and said, "We will be if you stop swinging. Keep moving. Keep hitting. Aim for the weak points, eyes, joints, necks. These things bleed, and if they bleed, they can die." Explosions rocked the east wall where the miners had buried fuel barrels under the ground and connected them to a loose electric wire. When the Zarn crossed over the barrels, they lit up like fireworks, sending black smoke and metal flying into the air. One alien lost half its body and crawled forward before a child dropped a heavy toolbox from a rooftop and crushed its skull. The aliens began pulling back, regrouping, but the humans did not let them. Humans chased them with wheelbarrows full of burning coals, swinging frying pans and homemade spears. The sun finally disappeared, leaving behind a dark night filled with orange fire and smoke. The humans were tired but not broken. They gathered in the center again. Many were bleeding, their clothes torn, their arms bruised, but their eyes were glowing with something new, not just survival but purpose. They had done the impossible. They had pushed back an army with nothing but scraps and instincts. Commander Rigg stood on top of a flipped hover truck, looking over his people, his voice rising above the noise of crackling fire and distant growls. "This is not over. They will come again, with more weapons, more soldiers, and more rage. But remember this: they thought we would be easy. They thought we were weak and civilized. They forgot what happens when humans get desperate. They forgot that to a human anything can be a weapon, and a human with nothing to lose is the most dangerous enemy in the universe." As the wind howled and the fires lit the night sky like fallen stars, The colony stood together, surrounded by broken machines, smoking weapons, and alien corpses. No one said a word, but in their hearts, they knew this was only the beginning of a war that would test everything they were and everything they believed in. And if they were going to survive, they had to keep fighting with whatever they had, because humans do. Not wait for miracles, they make them with bare hands, broken tools, and unshakable will. Chaos and ingenuity. Night had barely faded and smoke still danced in the morning wind when the second wave of Zarn landed, this time with more firepower, more soldiers, and more rage. They had underestimated the humans once, and their pride would not allow it again. Their drop pods hit the ground like thunder, leaving cracks in the soil and craters where gardens used to be, but what they found waiting was not fear. It was madness controlled and sharpened into something terrifying. The humans had not slept. Instead, they spent the dark hours building setting traps, boiling oil, welding blades into wheel spokes, and wrapping glass shards into baseballs using tape. They crafted shields from oven doors, armor from cooking pots, and helmets from broken drone shells. A group of children had even turned their old toy guns into slingshots, launching sharpened screws and nails with terrifying force. And in the middle of it all, Commander Rigg stood tall, bruised and bloodied, but burning with purpose. They had watched the enemy movements, studied their weaknesses, and now they were ready. The first Zarn scout entered the warehouse where the humans had hidden their wounded, expecting a quick slaughter. But instead, the alien stepped on a soap-covered floor, slipped, and fell backward into a tangle of copper wires connected to a live battery. The electricity shot the creature into unconsciousness, and a 10-year-old girl tied it up with rope made from torn curtains. Her mother smiled with tears in her eyes and said, "We do not need guns when we have brains." Across the colony, chaos had been turned into strategy. A group of farmers dug shallow pits and filled them with grease and sharp scrap metal. When the Zarn patrols walked over them, their heavy boots sank in, and they fell to their knees only to be swarmed by humans armed with shovels, kitchen knives, and metal rods. A butcher used a meat hook to drag one away from his squad, while a mechanic threw burning alcohol in another's face, causing it to scream and stagger blindly into a brick wall. In the old school building, the science teacher, Miss Patel, had turned her lab into a war room, mixing cleaning chemicals into makeshift smoke bombs and pressure sprays using soda bottles and gas canisters. She created explosions that disoriented the aliens long enough for students to attack with sticks and broken desks. When the aliens tried to storm the classrooms, they were met with a rain of boiling water and shards of glass falling from overhead fans, rigged to break apart the Zarn. Commanders were confused. Their armor was strong and their weapons advanced, but the humans attacked from the shadows, from rooftops and basements, from windows and vents. They used mirrors to reflect light into alien eyes, used sound to distract them with banging pots and echo chambers. One old woman banged metal lids together to draw a squad toward her barn, only for the floor to collapse under them, revealing a pit of sharpened steel rods and broken drills. Commander Rigg led from the front, his voice carrying through the smoke and fire like a storm, guiding his people through every trap, every strike, every scream. He charged into battle with a blowtorch in one hand and a metal pole in the other, shouting instructions and lifting fallen fighters back to their feet. When a Zarn warrior pinned him to a wall, he pulled a nail gun from his belt and drove 6 steel spikes into its armor until it fell twitching and gasping. In the west quarter, a boy named Malik, who had once dreamed of being a pilot, now used his drone toys to fly into Zarn ships fitted with batteries and flammable oil. They exploded in midair, taking out alien equipment and causing mass panic. He and his friends laughed and cried at the same time, knowing their childhood games had become instruments of survival. Even the animals joined the fight. Dogs were trained to run with bags of scrap metal attached to confuse heat sensors. Chickens carried small explosives taped to their backs and pecked at alien feet before bursting into feathers and flame. A parrot screamed "enemy spotted" from a rooftop every time a patrol came close, alerting humans below, who prepared ambushes with paint-thinner ropes and nets made from fishing lines. Zarn were not just losing ground, They were losing control. They began firing wildly, hitting their own soldiers in panic, while humans kept pressing forward, screaming, roaring, laughing. Through the madness, Commander Rigg stood on a broken crate, waving a signal torch and yelling, "We are not soldiers, but we are not prey. We are humanity, and we make war with everything we touch." By sundown, the second wave was in retreat. Some Zarn fled into the forest, others tried to fly, but their ships were tangled in nets, thrown from rooftops, or blinded by mirrors that reflected the sun directly into their landing systems. One alien tried to escape through a tunnel, only to find it flooded with boiling tea poured from a giant pot by 3 elderly women, who shouted cheers as the creature fled back the way it came. When the dust finally settled and silence returned, the colony stood not in ruins, but in victory. Bloodied hands held each other up, broken bodies leaned on walls, but their hearts beat with a rhythm of unshakable pride. From the sky, the battlefield looked like madness, but from the ground it was something else. It was human brilliance and stubbornness forged together into the most dangerous force in the galaxy. They had no fleets, no cannons, no armies, but they had each other, and they had the will to live, and that made them unstoppable. Commander Rigg looked at the stars above and whispered, turning the tide. The third day began with ash falling from the sky like black snow, and the air stank of smoke and metal, but the colony did not sleep. It did not cry, and it did not run. Instead, it rebuilt in silence, and in fury, children swept the streets to clear paths for traps. Women sharpened kitchen blades until their hands bled, and men welded scraps of steel into new shapes of destruction. And in the center of it all stood Commander Rigg, not resting, not eating, just watching, planning, calculating. They knew another wave would come, this time bigger, meaner, smarter, because the Zarn had finally realized what they were dealing with. They were not fighting a primitive colony, they were fighting humans, and that word now carried a weight the aliens did not understand yet. But soon they would. Rigg walked into the workshop where Joe and Malik were soldering wires to a stripped alien drone. Its legs twitched as sparks flew. Joe said, "We cracked its core. We can override it with a VR headset." Malik nodded and added, "I sensed it to the old gaming console. It works just like a controller now." Rigg watched the tiny bot rise from the table, fly in a circle, then hover perfectly still. He smiled for the first time in days and said, "Now we fight them with their own eyes." Across the colony, similar scenes unfolded. A welder turned a broken refrigerator into a mobile shield using wheels and reinforced panels. A nurse attached a laser thermometer to a makeshift scope and created a blinding beam that fried alien sensors. One farmer who had lost both legs in an old mining accident now rode a motorized wheelchair covered in flamethrowers that sprayed burning alcohol in every direction as he shouted war songs from his youth. Zarn came again at midday, their ships rumbling like thunder as they descended in tight formations. This time they brought heavy walkers, tall machines with armored legs and cannons that fired plasma the size of cars. But as soon as they touched down, the first walkers stepped on a pressure plate and triggered a chain of explosions that split its leg in two and sent it crashing into the dirt. The second walker turned to fire but was blinded by a homemade flare launched from a catapult made from bed frames and tension cords. From the rooftops, humans launched metal balls wrapped in wire that tangled in the alien joints, causing them to freeze and stumble and fall under the weight of confusion and chaos. The air filled with screams, but they were not screams of fear. They were war cries of people who had nothing left to lose and everything left to protect. In the eastern fields, the aliens tried to flank the colony, but were met with resistance like no military had ever seen. Children in camouflage made from blankets and leaves triggered nets of barbed wire, while elders poured soap and vinegar onto alien armor, causing chemical burns that made them stagger. Joe used her hacked drone to fly into an enemy formation, then dropped a bag full of nails wrapped around a grenade. The explosion tore through 3 Zarn and scattered the rest, who had never seen such tactics before. Malik took his modified hoverboard and attached 2 propane tanks to the back. He rode straight into the enemy line, screaming like a wild spirit and ignited the fuel, sending fire in every direction before leaping off at the last second and landing in a roll as the flames swallowed the aliens behind him. He looked back and whispered that was for my brother. Commander Rig stood at the front lines, gripping a massive wrench that he used like a sword, swinging it with all the force of a wrecking ball. He did not care for grace or style. He fought like a man possessed by history, by pain, by the ghost of Earth itself. When a Zarn aimed a rifle at him, he grabbed a hubcap and flung it like a disc, smashing the weapon and stunning the creature long enough to drive a metal rod through its chest. The battle turned strange then because the aliens began to retreat, not in order, but in panic. Some dropped their weapons and ran into the trees. Others screamed in their own language, begging for extraction. And that was when the human fighters stopped in their tracks, breathing heavy, sweating, bleeding, but victorious. Commander Rig stood on a pile of scrap and shouted across the battlefield, "Do you see it? Do you feel it? They bleed, they break, they fall, and we rise. This is not a colony. This is not a farm. This is not a mining post. This is Earth with teeth, with claws, with blood that never stops burning. And if they want this land, they will have to take it from our bones." Around him his people cheered, not because they enjoyed war, but because they had tasted power, the kind of power that comes from unity, from rage, from defiance. They had proved that with enough willpower, even a spoon could be a spear, even a mirror could be a laser, even a dream could be a weapon. And far above them in the sky, the Zarn High Command watched the chaos unfold through satellite feeds and fractured communication lines. One general turned to another and said, "They do not fight like any species we know. They do not follow patterns. They do not follow rules. They turn everything into danger, and they do not stop." The other general replied, "Send word to the council. Tell them we may need more than fire to defeat this race. We may need to understand their madness, or we will drown in it." And so the tide had turned, not because of weapons or numbers, but because humanity refused to die. They had turned chaos into strategy, fear into fire, and junk into justice. And the war was only beginning. Emotional fallout. The colony stood quiet after the third battle, not because it had found peace, but because it had found the weight of survival too heavy to speak about. Smoke still drifted from shattered homes and broken machines. And though victory had filled the people with pride, it had also carved deep wounds into their souls. Rows of makeshift graves lined the edges of the settlement with names painted in oil and ash, and beside them stood those who had lived, holding pieces of their lost ones in trembling hands. Some held burnt clothing, some held broken tools, some held nothing at all, just air and memory. Commander Rig moved through the crowd not as a hero, but as a man carrying the burden of every choice, every loss, every scream he had heard in the dark. He stopped beside the grave of a boy who once played music on scrap-made instruments, now buried with the same strings that could no longer sing. Jo stood nearby, holding her slingshot that had saved dozens of lives. Her face was bruised, her arms scraped, but her eyes were locked on the horizon, like she was trying to see the next battle before it came. They had time now. Not much, but enough to breathe, enough to plan. The Zarn had pulled back, regrouping, no doubt building stronger weapons, smarter machines, deadlier tactics. But the humans used their pause for more than defense. They used it to heal in this strange way only humans could. The mechanic whose hands were burned wrapped them in foil and kept working. The baker whose house had burned made bread from wild roots and shared it with anyone hungry. The children drew pictures of their lost parents on the walls, not to mourn, but to remembering the underground clinic. The nurse Mira, who once delivered babies, now patched bullet wounds and treated plasma burns. Her tools were kitchen knives sterilized in boiling water and sewing needles dipped in alcohol. Beside her lay a boy no older than 9, his leg gone, his face pale, but his grip strong as he held his sister's hand and whispered, "Tell them I did not cry." Meanwhile, the minds of the colony worked just as hard as their hands. Moloch had built a signal disruptor using parts from old radios and alien beacons. It jammed Zarn communications for miles around, allowing the humans to plan without being watched. A former Scientists had created a smoke bomb that released magnetic dust, disabling alien optics and confusing their pathing systems. They tested it by releasing a small cloud and watching 3 alien scouts walk in circles until they were knocked out with frying pans. Jo sat beside her drone, reprogramming it to mimic the voice of a Zarn officer. She played the recording over a loudspeaker and watched in satisfaction as a group of aliens obeyed the fake command and walked into a trap made of broken rebar and pulleys. When asked how she thought of it, she simply said, "Humans know how to lie better than most species. It is our superpower." But not all the pain came from the outside. Deep inside the colony, there were fractures growing, whispers of blame, anger, guilt. People argued over supplies. Some accused others of cowardice. Some wept alone in corners. Unable to process the grief, a man screamed at his wife for saving a stranger instead of their son, and Rig had to pull him away before fists turned to worse. The emotional wounds were sharper than any blade and harder to heal. Rig called a meeting in the shattered community hall and stood in front of his people with a piece of bent pipe in hand. He said this was once part of a sewage system. It carried waste and was never meant for battle, but last night it was used to save a child from a Zarn blade. Now it hangs here as proof that purpose is not found in design, but in will. You are all hurting, and that is good. It means you are still human, but we cannot let that pain divide us because the enemy is still out there, and they are waiting for us to fall apart. Room was silent, and then slowly people nodded one by one. Some hugged, some wept, but they began to rebuild again, not just walls and weapons, but trust and unity. They fixed radios, using broken headphones, turned mirrors into signaling devices, repurposed old vending machines into automated defenses that launched bottles filled with acid and oil when tripped the children, made traps from toys and string, and one boy created a slingshot that could launch marbles with enough force to crack armor. When asked what inspired him, he said, "I wanted to play again, and this was the only way I knew how." But as the stars returned and the winds carried new sounds from the forest, the colony knew the next attack would not be delayed long. The aliens had learned, they had evolved, and they would return with vengeance. But the humans were no longer just survivors, they were innovators, creators, defenders of something that no weapon could truly break. In a quiet moment, under the cracked dome of the greenhouse, Rig whispered to himself, "They think we are weak because we feel, because we cry, because we remember, but they do not understand yet that our emotions are not a flaw, they are fuel, and the fire they lit in us will never go out." Part 5. Betrayal and Sacrifice. The sun had not yet risen, but the colony was already awake. The air smelled of ash and sweat and old metal, but beneath the heaviness there was a pulse, a strange silence that did not belong, a silence that hid something dark and sharp. Like a blade waiting in the grass, Commander Rig walked the perimeter with Jo and Malik, their boots crunching over broken glass and sandbags, their eyes scanning every shadow and crack. But something felt off, something wrong, that could not be seen, but was known deep inside the bones. In the northern tower, a distress beacon began flashing. Not human, not Zarn, a signal too old to belong here and too clean to be an accident. Rig rushed up the stairs, followed by Jo, her slingshot in hand, and Malik holding a detonator that looked like a candy bar wrapped in wires. When they reached the top, they found the communications panel broken, not by battle, but by precision, and Rig knew. Then someone inside had done this. Someone who knew the systems, someone who wanted to be heard by the enemy. The traitor was found by noon. His name was Kale, once a pilot who had crashed on the colony 5 years ago and stayed to build a new life. He had worked with radios and machines, always alone, always quiet, and now he stood in chains surrounded by people he had shared meals with, sweated fought beside. His head was down, and he did not cry. He simply said, "I was trying to survive. They offered to spare me. They promised safety if I gave them your defenses." Gasps filled the square, and fists tightened and voices rose, but Rig held up his hand and silence fell like a curtain. Kale said, "They have a new weapon, something that burns through walls and bodies, something we cannot stop." I thought I could buy time, but now it is too late. I told them too much. They are coming with everything. Rig looked at him and said, "Then you are going to help us stop them?" Kale nodded, knowing what that meant. He was no longer a man. He was now a shield, a tool, a sacrifice. They wired explosives to his chest and gave him a jammer to carry one that would disable the new alien weapon. For just a moment, long enough to strike hard and fast, long enough to buy them a chance as the Zarn approached in silence. This time with sleek machines and glowing weapons shaped like spears of fire. Kale walked alone into the field wearing a white flag painted on his back and the device pulsing at his chest. He reached the enemy line, raised his hands and stood still. And when they surrounded him and pointed their weapons, he whispered for the colony, then pressed the switch. The explosion tore the sky into pieces, and the sound was not like thunder, but like bones cracking under weight. It shattered the alien vanguard and opened a hole in their ranks, and before the dust even settled, the humans charged out of the ruins, screaming with rage and grief and power. Joe led the first line with her drone flying ahead, blaring recordings of alien screams. Malik rode a modified scooter covered in spikes and pipes, launching smoke grenades and acid jars every direction. Rig held a shield made from a solar panel and swung a wrench like a sword. Beside him marched the butcher, the baker, the schoolteacher, all now warriors shaped by fire and loss. The aliens tried to regroup, but the jammer had done more than disable weapons. It had confused their targeting, turned their orders into static. They fired blindly and hit their own soldiers while the humans struck with precision every attack. Planned every trap sprung. One alien stepped into a narrow alley and was met by falling bricks loosened by string and tension. Another opened a door and triggered a pan full of nails that flew like hornets into its throat. On the western ridge, a group of elders had set up mirrors and used the sunlight to blind snipers while children crawled through the grass and slipped knives into enemy ankles. A man with one leg used a catapult built from an old bed frame to launch jars of bees that stung and swarmed in waves. The aliens had no response. They had never faced an enemy like this. Then came the new weapon, a massive cannon on wheels, pushed by 6 Zarn soldiers, glowing blue and humming with deadly heat. It fired once and melted a steel gate into liquid, but before it could fire again, Malik charged with a crate of batteries wired to explode. He tossed it under the cannon and rolled aside as the blast tore through its center. The explosion shattered its core and knocked the soldiers back in flames. Malik stood coughing, blood running from his ears, and smiled as the machine sparked and died. He looked at Joe and said, "I always wanted to ride into battle on wheels." And then he fell to his knees, laughing and crying. By sundown, the battlefield was silent. Once more the humans had held the line, broken the weapon, and buried their traitor. But the price was carved deep into their hearts. The colony had changed again, not just in size or shape, but in soul. They had lost one of their own to fear and another to redemption. And they had proven that no betrayal could break them, and no sacrifice would be forgotten. Commander Rig stood before the people, his voice rough and tired and filled with iron. He said, "We bleed, we break, we burn, but we rise, and with every fall we grow sharper, stronger, and harder to kill. They thought we would fold, but we forged a weapon from pain and wielded it with every breath." The people nodded, and they lit torches made from bones and metal and stood in the dark, facing the stars, waiting for what came next. Last stand of Earthkind. Night was cold, the wind carried the distant hum of alien engines as they hovered just out of reach, but they were coming. Everyone knew it. The scouts reported movement in the hills, and the sky was filled with the eerie sound of approaching ships. A new wave of invaders was coming to finish what they had started, this time with everything they had. No tricks, no mercy, just raw destruction. The last attack had left the Zarn reeling, but they were relentless, and they would return stronger. But the people of the colony had changed. They had become something more than survivors. They had become a force, something that could not be ignored, something that did not retreat, something that fought until there was nothing left but a chance for victory. The battle had taken a toll on everyone. The bodies of their dead lay in makeshift graves. The homes were barely standing. The supplies were Running low, but their spirits were not broken. The fire in their hearts still burned, and it was enough to hold. Their ground commander, Rig, stood alone on the hill, overlooking the village where the final fight would take place. Behind him, a group of soldiers and civilians alike prepared the last of the traps, the last of the makeshift weapons, the last defenses they could muster in the fields near the ruins of their homes. Children wrapped their wounds with cloth and kept their eyes on the horizon. Some whispered prayers while others sharpened stones into blades. And still others held their weapons like it was the only thing that kept them grounded. Rig looked at his people. They had no more ships, no more technology to match the Zarn, but they had something the aliens did not have: a will to survive and a creativity that could turn anything into a weapon. He felt the weight of his leadership press down on him. He had seen so many fall and so many rise, and he knew that no matter what happened, they would not go down without taking the fight to the enemy. He walked back to the village square, where Joe stood beside a pile of scrap metal welding pieces together, with Malik watching from a distance, his face grim but determined. He walked up to them both and said, "We hold the line here. If we fall, they will take the rest of this planet, but we will not fall. We will show them the power of humanity and what happens when we are pushed to the edge." Joe nodded, her eyes red from lack of sleep, but sharp and focused. Malik looked up from the work he was doing and said, "I'll never stop fighting. I'll fight until I'm nothing but dust." Rig placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "We all will, and when this is over, the dust will remember us." The ground trembled as the Zarn approached their ships, hovering like dark clouds overhead, and their heavy walkers crushing the earth beneath them. The air became thick with tension as the humans stood ready, not in ranks but in unity. They had become a wall of flesh and steel, bound together by loss, by pain, by the will to protect the last of their world. The first wave of Zarn hit with full force, their ships opening fire with precision, weapons designed to burn through anything in their path. The sky lit up with fire as their ships unleashed devastating blasts, but the humans were prepared with every trap, every trick they had learned from their previous battles. They used mirrors to reflect the blasts back into the ships, blinding the enemy, while others threw Molotov cocktails that exploded into flames, causing chaos in their ranks. On the ground, the Zarn advanced, their soldiers charging with their deadly plasma rifles, firing indiscriminately at anything that moved. But the humans did not run. They stood firm like a storm. They fought with everything they had and more, throwing tools, rocks, whatever they could find at the alien invaders. A farmer with a sickle swung it into the chest of an alien warrior, and a child with a rock in her hand knocked another down, while a woman with a pitchfork stabbed it in the side. The Zarn were confused and enraged. They had expected an easy conquest. They had expected to find a broken people, but instead they found madness, a madness that knew no fear and no surrender. They pushed forward with more violence, more aggression, but it only fed the fire inside. The humans, they fought with everything they had left, with every ounce of rage and grief they could summon. Malik and Joe led the charge at the alien command center, where the walkers were beginning to regroup. They ran as fast as they could through the wreckage and into the heart of the enemy lines. Joe fired a makeshift crossbow with deadly accuracy, hitting one alien in the throat, while Malik launched a grenade into a group of soldiers, sending them scattering in all directions. They did not stop to look back. They did not stop to question whether they would survive. They just kept moving forward. Rig and the others held the outer defenses, using everything they had left. The walls were crumbling, the traps were running out, but their will was unbroken. They were not soldiers. They were not trained fighters, but they were human, and that was enough to make them dangerous. They fought with the heart of 1,000 generations of warriors who had never known defeat. The battle raged for hours until the sky turned dark and the sound of gunfire faded into the distant hills. The Zarn had been pushed back, but not without cost. The humans had lost more than they could count. But they had made the Zarn retreat. They had made them fear the power of humanity. The battle was over for now. But the war was not yet. One Commander, Rig, stood alone in the center of the battlefield, looking over the destruction. The fires still burned. around them, but the colony stood defiant, not as a broken people, but as a victorious one. He looked up at the stars and whispered, "We may have lost so much, but we will never lose ourselves. We will never stop fighting as long as we breathe and won." The universe will remember the day that humanity proved anything could be a weapon when we used it too. Victory etched in blood, the battlefield lay still under the rising sun like a scar that refused to heal, but the colony stood together in the quiet aftermath, not broken, not defeated, but alive. The air was thick with smoke and dust, and the ground was marked with the weight of all that had been lost. But in the silence, there was also something else, a deep sense of accomplishment, something that came not from the victory itself, but from the fact that they had done the impossible. They had proven to the universe that humans would never give up, no matter the odds, no matter the enemy. Commander Rigg stood at the edge of the battlefield, his eyes scanning the wreckage of both alien and human nature. He had led them through this battle, and now it was his duty to guide them through the aftermath. The losses were heavy. They had lost some of their best fighters, their most creative minds, their strongest hearts, but the survivors stood tall. They had fought with everything they had, and it had been enough to push the Zarn back. For now the Zarn had underestimated them. They had thought they would be easy prey, thought that they could crush humanity under the weight of their technology and firepower. But they had been wrong. The humans had turned their pain into power and their grief into strength. They had used whatever they had at their disposal, whether it was a kitchen knife, a piece of scrap metal, or the knowledge passed down through generations. They had fought not just to survive, but to protect the future. They had fought for a world that was still worth saving. Jo stood next to Rigg, her face smeared with dirt and sweat, her eyes tired, but still sharp. She had lost friends, family members in this battle, but she had also gained something she had never known before, a sense of purpose, something that could not be broken, no matter the cost. She looked at the smoldering wreckage of the Zarn ships and said, "I never thought it would end like this." Rigg glanced at her and said, "It hasn't ended yet, but we've taken the first step towards something we can call victory." Malik walked up beside them, his leg still bandaged from the blast that had nearly taken his life, but his spirit unbroken. He smiled at Rigg and said, "We did it. We made them run. They don't get to just take our world like it's nothing." Rigg nodded and said, "No, they don't. But we can't let up now. This is just the beginning. They'll come back stronger next time. We have to be ready to show them that this world is ours, and we're not giving it up without a fight." The survivors began to move through the village, gathering what was left of their supplies and weapons. But there was no hurry. Now they had proven that they could survive, and that they could fight back no matter how much they had lost. The human spirit was not something that could be crushed or conquered. It was something that could never be broken, no matter how much the enemy tried to break it. A memorial was built in the center of the village where the fallen were honored and remembered, their names written on a wall of stone that would stand for as long as the colony remained. The people gathered in silence around it, paying their respects, not just to those who had fallen, but to what they had all fought for, the future of their world. Rigg stood before the memorial, watching as the people of the colony gathered around. He could see the grief in their eyes, but also the pride. He knew that they would carry the memory of this battle with them for the rest of their lives, but he also knew that they would never forget the lesson they had learned that day, that no matter the odds, no matter the enemy, humans could turn anything into a weapon and use it to fight for their survival. As the sun began to set over the horizon, the people of the colony stood together in silence, their heads held high, their hearts filled with the knowledge that they had done the impossible, and that they would do it again if they had to. Rigg turned to the survivors and said, "We have shown them what humanity can do. We have proven that we will not be cowed. We will not be broken. We will fight with everything we have, and we will never stop fighting for this world." Somewhere out in the stars, the Zarn would remember this day, the day they learned that humans were not a species to be ignored or dismissed. They would remember the day they learned that no matter how much firepower they had, no matter how much technology they wielded, they could never defeat the strength of the human will, the strength that came from love, from memory, from Lawson, from the will to survive, Rig looked up at the stars once more and whispered to himself, "This is our world, and we will fight for it with everything we have." And in the darkness of space, the stars watched silently, the universe holding its breath as humanity prepared for whatever came next. This was not the end, it was just the beginning of a new war, a war that humanity would fight with every weapon at its disposal, and with a spirit that could never be crushed, no matter the odds. The beginning of everything. The colony stood in silence, the last of the smoke drifting into the cold night sky above them. The stars had never looked so distant, and yet so close, as if the universe itself had paused to watch this moment to see what would come next. The battle was over, but the war had only just begun. Humanity had survived, but now they had to rebuild not just their homes, but their future. Their identity, the very essence of who they were. Rig stood at the edge of the village, looking out into the horizon, his face worn but resolute, the winds of the earth blowing softly across his face as if carrying the whispers of those who had fallen, the weight of their sacrifice heavy on his shoulders, but he carried it willingly, knowing that their fight had not been in vain. The future was still theirs to shape, and it was a future that would be built on the ashes of the old world and the strength of a new one. Joe and Malik stood beside him, their eyes fixed on the horizon. As well, their faces tired, but their hearts full of something stronger, something more enduring than the pain of battle. They had seen what it meant to fight for something worth saving. They had felt the power of humanity's will, and now they knew there was nothing that could stop them, nothing that could make them kneel to any enemy or force them to surrender. Survivors of the colony had gathered in the square. One by one, they had come together to honor the fallen, to remember those who had given everything for the survival of their people, but also to look ahead to the future, to the promise of what they could still become, what they could still achieve if they continued to fight with everything they had left. In the center of the square stood a monument made of stone and metal. It was simple, but it carried with it the weight of their victory, and the sacrifices they had made. Engraved into the stone were the names of the fallen, their faces forever captured in the memory of their people, a reminder that their struggle would never be forgotten, that their courage would live on in every person who had stood and fought beside them. Rig turned to face the people, his voice steady as he spoke. "We have won this battle, but the war is far from over. The Zarn will return. They will come with more firepower, more weapons, but they will never have what we have. They will never have our spirit, our will, our determination to protect the things that matter most. They may have technology, but we have something far stronger. We have each other, and as long as we stand together, there's nothing we cannot overcome." The people stood in silence, listening to his words, but inside each of them was a spark, a fire that could not be extinguished. They had been pushed to the brink, but they had risen, and they had proven that there was nothing more dangerous than a human who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Rig raised his fist into the air, and the people cheered, their voices rising in a chorus that echoed across the land, a sound that carried with it the promise of a future that would be built on the blood, sweat, and tears of those who had fought, and those who would fight to protect it. The colony had not just survived, it had been reborn, and as long as there were humans left, there would always be hope. Stars above them flickered as if acknowledging the victory of Earthkind and the promise of a new era, one where humanity would no longer be silent, no longer be weak, no longer be overlooked. The universe had witnessed what humans could do when pushed to the edge, and it would never forget. Rig looked up at the stars once more, his eyes filled with the weight of everything they had endured, but also the hope of what was to come. "We may be small in the grand scheme of the universe, but we are mighty in ways they will never understand. We are humanity, and we will fight for our place in the stars until the very end." And so they would. The end.